In the context of brutal violence in the Middle East, both from Hamas and the Israeli army, Western journalists and politicians are trying to airbrush out the occupation as its ultimate cause. Speaking to Rachel Johnson on LBC, Mohammed Al-Kurd pushed back against that framing.
We have seen a situation of lose-lose, which has been obtaining for far too long, for decades, really since the inception of the State of Israel.
Let's start here. It's certainly not a lose-lose situation. There is one population that lives under a system which has been deemed by many, many global human rights organizations as a system of apartheid. It is not a win-win. There's a population that lives inside a cage without citizenship, without right to movement, without access to clean water, and there's a population that enjoys its full rights. I mean, if your major concern is that they have some bits of anxiety here and there when Hamas fires.
I think you are minimizing. You're minimizing the Israeli experience in the last 36 hours.
I think you're minimizing. When you compare an occupied population, a population that has been ethnically cleansed, a population that lives under a system of apartheid, to a population that is afraid of the population that is occupying, you are minimizing, not me.
I mean, that was really well put, right? And it is important to say, look, it's perfectly normal and right, I think, to have sympathy with people who are worried that their loved ones might have been killed over the past 36 hours, right? I assume Rachel Johnson was talking about the wider anxiety that people feel. But that doesn't compare to the fact that for decades and decades and decades, people have had no freedom, no sovereignty, that people are killed in Palestine with impunity all the time, and the world doesn't sort of light up the Palestinian flag on public buildings. So this idea that, this is just, again, she was also putting forward this thing, it's too lose-lose, it's hard for Israel, it's hard for Palestine, why can't you just agree to get along? It ignores the fact that this is a relationship of occupier and occupied. It's not just there's two ethnic groups and they can't get along. There is a 56-year-long occupation of Palestine, right? Now, if you're a one-stater, you'll say there's a 70-year occupation of Palestine because you'll say Israel itself has no right to exist. I sit on the fence when it comes to this, but I think everyone agrees that the occupation of the West Bank is illegal, always has been, and it has been going on for more than 50 years. Of course, that framing isn't surprising when it comes from Rachel Johnson. She is the sister of Boris Johnson. Surely the BBC, though, bastion of neutrality, would do better. That's not what Palestinian ambassador to the UK, Hussam Zomlot, found when he appeared on BBC News.
You just condemned Israel for killing civilians, and you won't condemn Hamas for killing civilians.
How many times you have interviewed Israeli officials, Louise? Hundreds of times. Hundreds of times. How many times Israel have committed war crimes right live on your own cameras? Do you start by asking them to condemn themselves? Have you? You don't. You don't. No, I'll answer that question. You don't. You know why I refuse to answer this question? Because I refuse the premise of it. Because at the very heart of it is misrepresentation of the whole thing. Because it's the Palestinians that are always expected to condemn themselves. I mean, come on, this is a political conflict. We have been denied our rights for a long time. So this is the wrong starting point. The right starting point is to focus on the root causes, is to try and get out of this extreme dark tunnel, as opposed to this business by BBC and the mainstream media for 75 years. You bring us here whenever there are Israelis who are killed. Did you bring me here when many Palestinians in the West Bank, more than 200 over the last few months? Do you invite me when there is such Israeli provocations in Jerusalem and elsewhere? Because what Israelis have seen, which we started by saying tragic, the last 48 hours, the Palestinians see every day for the last 50 years. You know the situation in Gaza, you've just described it. This is the biggest open-air prison. Those people, 2 million, have been taken hostage by Israel for the last 16 years. So I'm saying this just to say, Louise, perhaps this is about time we abandon this rhetoric, very dangerous, this framework, and we start giving people the real ugly truth sometimes.
Also, Sam Zomlot, now, after giving that interview, he's spoken to The World Transformed, and he said that 6 of his family members have been killed in raids on Gaza. So, just so awful to be in that situation. And it is the case that it is always representatives of the Palestinians who are asked to condemn things way more than representatives of the Israelis, even though the Israelis are the occupier. Let's go to one more clip. On his CNN show, host Fareed Zakaria conducted a long interview with Mustafa Barghouti. He's leader of the Palestinian National Initiative. Now, Barghouti was allowed to put the Palestinian perspective for nearly 10 minutes, ending with this.
We have lived all our lives under occupation. My father lived under occupation. My daughter is living under occupation. We want a time when we, the Palestinians, will be free. Hamas was not there 30 years ago or 40 years ago. But before that, PLO was described as terrorist. Any Palestinian who struggles for his right or for freedom is described as terrorist. And the question here, do we have the right to struggle for freedom? Do we have the right to struggle for real democracy? Do we have the right to have normal democratic elections, which unfortunately Israel and the United States don't support? I think we are entitled to that. But the unfortunate thing, if we struggle in a military form, we are terrorists. If we struggle in a non-violent way, we are described as violent. If we even resist with words, we are described as provocators. If you support Palestinian and you are a foreigner, they describe you as anti-Semite. And if you are a Jewish person, and there are many of those, who supports Palestinian cause, they call him self-hating Jew. This should end. It doesn't make sense. We should all have equal life. We should all have peace. We should all have justice. And we should all live in dignity. The main way to achieve that is to end occupation, end the system of apartheid that I am sure no Jewish person can be proud of. Time has come for that, and time has come for justice and freedom. If we achieve that, there will be no violence and nobody will be hurt.
So that interview's been seen millions of times on Twitter. Now, I have to say, Ash, I found the media coverage of this, it hasn't been balanced, but it's been more balanced than I've expected. And it's been a hell of a lot better than what we've been hearing from our politicians. I think there's a big difference as well here between people who are there, people who are in Palestine who have reported on the ground there, and then you've got sort of the commentators based in London. I saw Lise Doucette on the BBC, who was sort of speaking, she's their international correspondent, and she was sort of saying, she's speaking to people in Gaza or speaking to people in Palestine, I'm not precisely sure what part, and she was saying, they're saying, we're completely desperate. What else can we do? Right? And you often do have some journalists who have knowledge on the ground being quite open-minded in terms of what's going on here, but then you have sort of the politicians and you have the comment editors and you have the people who do the headlines who are really, really strict by just saying, no, terrorism, good guys, bad guys. But, of course, the Palestinians who have sort of been giving interviews to mainstream media have, as they have been in every time this issue flares up in the past few years, have been doing a phenomenal job. I suppose I want your views on sort of how the media has been covering this over the past 3 days.
Well, I think the simple fact of representing Palestinian voices in British and American media has changed an awful lot in the past 10, 15 years. I mean, once upon a time, you would just never hear from Palestinians, whereas now I think there is at least a bit of understanding amongst editors and producers that you need Palestinian voices to comment on these events the same way, well, not the same way, because of course they're held to a completely different standard, but it would be a notable absence if you only had Israeli or pro-Israel voices. So I think there has been some efforts to reach out and include some degree of Palestinian representation. But I was talking to Mohammed El-Kurd about this on Downstream not that long ago. And one of the things that he said he felt intensely frustrated by is that he's always asked to do the exact same thing when he's asked to do media about Palestine. He's asked either to condemn violence or to prove that he's not anti-Semitic, or he's asked to sort of do this performative suffering. He described it as showing our bruises, showing our bruises, showing how we suffer, sort of becoming a bit of like a spectacle of pain. And what's missing from that is the political struggle that's going on. You're only allowed to be a perfect victim of violence. And of course, a perfect victim never struggles, never resists, never fights back, never tries to change their circumstances from a position of subjection to one of parity. And I think that this is why, just reflecting on our earlier conversation about how should we, as left-wing people, as people who are horrified by violence against civilians and recognize that the civilians who have suffered the most from this ongoing, shouldn't even say conflict, but ongoing illegal occupation has been the Palestinians. How do you even begin to understand this? I think that this is where you also have to remember what the nature of people's struggles for freedom, what that's been like. If you look at the armed wing of the ANC and the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, to the activities of the FLN in Algeria when Algeria was under French colonization, there were things that were done that I don't think any of us would be comfortable with and would certainly be against international law. Now, that's not to say, well, because it happened in these struggles and these struggles won, it means that absolutely everything is morally justified. But that gives you an understanding about how you end up in an escalating cycle of violence, which is driven predominantly by the most powerful actor, i.e., the occupier, i.e., the apartheid state. And that's the kind of thing which Palestinians very rarely get the opportunity to say, or if they do, they're suddenly put back in that box of terrorist, Hamas supporter. Why won't you condemn? Because the best that they can hope for within this very limited media script is to be the perfect victim. As Mohammed El-Kurd, talked to me about, that's not a good place to be. It's not a powerful place to be.